I now want to go to the issue of politics and policies for a moment, because something occurred to me last night. I was watching military history, as I usually do at night if there's a good one on, and last night's was very good. It was the rise of fascism in Europe in World War II. And I realized that the battle lines that were drawn during World War II with the rise of fascism and the counterpoint of communism that battle is still going on. And much of the criticism against conservatives in America, and of myself, as a matter of fact, comes from those who are afraid that we represent the tendencies of Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Franco, etc. But they have to understand that we fear that they represent the murderous mentality of Joseph Stalin, who killed 30 million Russians, put them in re-education camps, killed them, worked them to death. Or that the communist socialists who think that they're progressives frighten we middle Americans because we remember Pol Pot in Cambodia, who was a mild-mannered professor like Obama, but frightening part. Pol Pot was a professor in Cambodia. He went to Paris to study Marxism, which he did, and he came back so impressed with his studies that he introduced a Marxist economy, a Marxist society, rather, in Cambodia, and they wound up rounding up anybody with eyeglasses, teachers, doctors, lawyers, police chiefs, engineers. In other words, the entire educated class of Cambodia was put to work in the fields and killed. 3 million of them were killed in a very small country. Remember the killing fields? That's what communism brought. So we in the middle fear communism almost more than we fear fascism. Certainly we remember the ovens of Hitler. But these battle lines have never been... This battle, rather, has never been resolved in the hearts of most people in the West. I realized that last night, almost for the first time, and I thought I had thought this through. I hadn't really thought it through thoroughly. I said, why in the world, if a person listens to me, after a long period of time, they come to understand that I'm a very thoughtful, very educated, very compassionate human being, how in the world could they ever think that I would want death camps or concentration camps or Zyklon B? I would never want a thing like that. How could they not understand how we see them as the enemies of freedom? Because wherever you turn in America, it is the liberal fascists who have closed down thought, who have locked down the universities, who have turned corporations into re-education camps, who have imposed perversity education on everybody across America. It is they who are the fascists of our time, in the minds of most of us, I said to myself. And yet, they pose as the progressive, avant-garde, liberal. We all know it's rubbish. They are the fascists of our time. So everything they tell us they're afraid of, they are in fact themselves. That we understand. Well, let's go back to the Spanish Civil War for a minute. I know this is so off the topic of Martha's Vineyard that it's worth going there for another second. During the upheavals of the 1930s, when dictatorships were coming to power, you had Stalin in Russia, you had Hitler in Germany, you had Mussolini in Italy. These were people who believed in state control of everything. Centralized control, federal government control over every aspect of the people's lives, without exception. And here in America, we had that as well in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You don't know that. He is held up as a liberal icon, when in fact FDR had many totalitarian tendencies, and by the way, introduced many totalitarian policies, incidentally, which I pointed out in Trickle Up Poverty. So we had our own totalitarianism that emerged in the late 30s and early 40s under FDR. I don't think you know that. You know that. He's held up as a role model for Obama, by the way. We're told that FDR was one of Obama's role models, excuse me. And yet, if you actually analyze who FDR was, he was not really that benevolent. He was a dictator. He was a dictator. And so we go back again to that period of time when totalitarian regimes were emerging across the globe. What happened in Spain was very interesting. Franco, who had been banished, I believe, to Morocco to lead some kind of expatriate Spanish army, basically was brought back across the Straits of Gibraltar with the aid of Adolf Hitler's boats and airplanes, and he eventually took over. Well, he didn't just take over. He had to fight the loyalists, so to speak, in Spain, those who wanted a communist government. And guess who joined the communists in Spain? Take a guess who Franco's forces were fighting tooth and nail. They were fighting the International Brigade. The International Brigade consisted of thousands of communists and otherwise, let us say, progressives of their time, who were willing to put down their fountain pens and take a ship to Spain, pick up a gun, it would, in that case, probably a Mauser and a Mauser 90, and go on the front lines and kill the fascists. And kill they did. What you don't know is that many of these good progressives slaughtered innocent civilians in Spain. Many of these communists from New York City in particular who hold themselves up, some of them are still living, barely. Maybe they're in their 90s, maybe your grandfather was one of them and you think he was a hero. They shot priests to death in the public square. Did you know that? Did you know that it was not the fascists who killed the priests in Spain, but it was the, quote, progressives who killed the priests in Spain? I'll tell you more about history when I come back on the Savage Nation. Savage. Now, many of you probably say she's entitled to it, and I disagree with you on that, and so we can move on. And I moved on then to the Spanish Civil War, World War II, and I was talking particularly about Franco. Now, before we go into this in more detail, I want to say a few. There's much more nuance to it, of course. I'm not giving you a whole lesson in a thumbnail. I'm giving you a fracture, a fault line. You had fascism versus communism. Both dictatorships killed tens of millions of people, tortured, maimed, and murdered. The tactics of both sides were a disaster for humanity. Let's be very clear about that. But let's not hold up the so-called progressives as some role model. They were murderous bastards. They tortured people in caves. I personally met one in North Beach, an old man, when I first moved to San Francisco, an old stinking drunk in one of the bars. He used to sit with his eyes glowing, telling how he tortured fascists to death and they cried as he tortured them and killed them in caves. So don't think that all of the people who joined the international brigades did so because they hated fascism. Many of them were just bloodthirsty murderers who wanted an excuse to kill. So let's be clear, it happened on both sides. And the priests who were killed in Spain were not killed by Franco. They were killed by the progressives. The same progressives who have destroyed the church in America today. The descendants of the same mentality have destroyed the Catholic Church in this country. And now I want to go into Hitler and Franco for a minute. Franco did a horrible thing, did many horrible things. Maybe the most horrible thing he did was permit Hitler to use his Stuka bombers to see how they worked on a Basque town called Guernica. And the town was smashed into rubble. In fact, Guernica is a battle cry for many Basque people to this day. I have Basque friends, and they know what Guernica means. And of course, they understand who did it. It was Franco and Hitler who destroyed Guernica. So naturally, they would tend to move to the other side. If you were them, you would also. But then there's another side to the story. You don't know this. Many of you don't know this. But Franco forbade Spaniards to fight in the West against any democracies. Franco's common ground with Hitler was weakened by Hitler's propagation of Nazi mysticism and Hitler's attempts to manipulate Christianity, which went against Franco's commitment to defending Christians, Christianity, and Catholicism. You don't know that as well. And then what about Franco and the Jews? Many Jews don't know anything about this. They assume because he was a fascist, he was a friend of Hitler, he wanted to kill the Jews. Many of you don't know this because you're ignorant of history. But you have to understand your progressive friends are your enemy. Many of you don't understand this. Franco built no concentration camps. He did not hand Jews over to Germany. As a matter of fact, during the entire war, especially after 1942, the Spanish borders were more or less open for Jewish refugees running from Vichy France and Nazi-occupied territories in Europe.
Savage.